Yep, working. Cool. Righto. So, soldering. The biggest mistake people make is they think of it like local heat, which it's not. If you look at the tip of your soldering iron, you know, this one's quite thin because it's designed for like small circuit boards and hobby stuff. Now, obviously, the more powerful the soldering iron, the thicker the tip gets, which, when you think about it, if you could do the job with power alone, the tip wouldn't get any bigger. It'd always stay the same size. So the reason for the increase in size is because not only does the tip obviously get hot, but it also has like an amount of stored heat. The larger the tip, the larger the amount of storage, the bigger the joint you can successfully do. So really, when you're talking about your soldering iron, the limitations come down to the size of the tip. And one easy way to increase the size of the tip and make the soldering iron more effective is to obviously just pour solder on the tip. Because the more solder you lay on the tip, the more heat energy it starts to store. And it's stored in the lead. So you've got molten lead on the end that obviously contributes to the amount of total energy actually stored when you start tinning and things like that. So, and there's also other factors that help as well, like the molten lead increases the surface area of the round tip. If you put something round on a flat surface, only the very point of the round surface touches. Whereas if you put a liquid on the end of it and then touch a round surface, the liquid will obviously form to the edge of the surface. So you basically get a more effective transfer of heat also. Now, it also works in the opposite. If you go and tin the crap out of your wire so there's too much solder, you've then got to have an even greater amount of energy to obviously finalise the joint. So tinning is a very sparing thing. You'll just apply like a bit of a dob to the end of it, just so that you know you've got a fairly effective contact area, a little bit of extra sort of meat in the end of the soldering iron to sort of store up that energy, and then you'll just sort of tin it on there. And effectively, like when you do too big a join, you'll know, because you'll start off with liquid and then it'll go solid. And the reason for that is because you were just trying to heat too much stuff and the soldering iron couldn't keep up. It ran out of stored energy between the tip and, you know, whatever solder you had on the end there, and the whole show goes cold. And at that point, you stop soldering because you were just trying to do too big a join with too small a surface area. So essentially, when you're doing this, you always tin your ends. It pays to have something to try and hold the Deans. Bloody clothes pegs screwed to a piece of wood are a really good one. So same deal as before. You'll apply a little bit to the end of the soldering iron here, and then you'll just try and get it on the tab. Now, the idea is you're not trying to heat the tab, like you're just trying to essentially contribute to the solder that's on the end of the soldering iron, and it'll just transfer the heat across. Once the tab on the Deans is hot enough, the solder will just flow anyway, and it'll pretty well just like flatten out on the end of the Deans connector to give you like a fairly even amount of solder. Doesn't have to be perfect, just has to be sort of adequate. Same again. Hopefully this is actually in earshot of the camera. This one's taken a bit longer. I probably didn't have enough solder actually on the tip, so, and you can see that's, you know, straight away that's made a difference. The end of the soldering iron was drier, so it didn't transfer as quickly. Right, always remember, between tinning and finalising your soldered joint, you've got a heat shrink that you need to apply to your Deans connector. Normally there's only 2 bits, in this particular case there's 4, because we're doing the heat shrink over the busted wires on the battery here. Okay, Now, so Dean's pins are really, really good conductors, right? And it sort of pays to be mindful of that because they'll transfer heat extremely quickly. So when you're hanging onto the connector, and also I should point out this top pin, so it makes like a T shape. Okay, the top pin's always the positive. Good Dean's connectors, and I don't know whether you can actually make that out in the video, but good Dean's connectors will always be marked to say positive and negative. But the top pin's always positive. You don't, it's just black and white. There's no sort of like, some do it this way, some do it the other way. That's just how it is. It's how Dean's intended it to be when they made the connector. Righto, so, right, tinning is done. Now we're just going to do our join. Soldering iron's a bit hot, so it's starting to burn the resin. That's another thing, temperature control. Temperature control is about preventing the resin from burning. You can solder joins really, really hot, particularly in components like this where they don't need like a controlled temperature. They just need to be hot enough to make the solder flow. Temperature control is really something that you'd worry about with small circuits and things like that, where you've got expensive components that can overheat. You would never sort of panic about temperature control. This thing's on maximum, and I don't think the thermostat works. It's just going flat out. I guess advantages for that, especially when you're playing with Dean's connectors, you can actually overheat the pins on the Deans. You'll notice the plastic will start to go molten around the edges of the pins. They will actually distort if you go too far with it, and the pin will slip. And usually at that point you have to replace them. So doing the same as before, okay? So bit of solder on the end just to increase our sort of contact patch. Obviously build up a bit more sort of stored energy. Start preheating the wire so that it melts. And if you've got the wire tip already melted, right, at the point in time that you start soldering, that contributes to that stored energy. The wire's already hot. So when you get to the point that you're actually soldering the component, the component that can be potentially damaged from too much heat, you've got stored energy in the tip of the soldering iron, the tinning on the wire itself, and then when it gets to the actual Deans, it takes maybe half a second and it's done. So that's it. That is a Dean's plug on a battery. Now, with this particular one, I've actually done it the wrong way around. So I'm going to desolder it now quickly and put the other one back on there. But that essentially gives you an idea on how soldering goes. Now, the other cool thing about soldering is, say, for example, so in this particular case where I've done it wrong, I just apply a little bit of local heat, bam, it's off. Perfect connection, super efficient, will never fail unless the area is over 200 degrees Celsius, which if any part of your car is over 200 degrees Celsius, you've got bigger issues. It's perfect, really. Twitching shit up and taping it will never be efficient, always be unreliable, higher risk on your components. It's not the ideal way to go about things. This Dean's connector is being a sod. Come on, you. We have things to do. Probably noticed in the video I haven't actually cleaned the tip of the soldering iron. I just flick the daggy solder off the end. That's not good practice. Really, you should have a wet sponge close handy. Like a proper soldering iron is better because it's made from natural sponge. Natural sponge doesn't burn, whereas synthetic sponges, as soon as you apply a bit of heat to them, they'll usually just bloody melt and stick to everything and make a big mess. Yeah, anything that's pretty well soaked, made from natural fibres, will work well though. You know, like a cotton rag or any of that sort of stuff. You know, wool, cotton wool would work if you had to use something like that, provided the tip of your soldering iron wasn't too daggy. Let's tin this up again so we're ready to do this properly. Get all this crap off here. Right. And going again. Everything was molten there. I just bloody took a bit long to work it out, I think. The tip of that wire's gone to shit. I'm actually going to apply just a sniff of fresh solder to this. Now, the solder I'm using is rosin core, which is actually a thing. There's resin core and rosin core. Now, rosin core apparently is actually designed for wiring that is aged, or it's probably not ideal considering that the wiring in this battery, there's nothing wrong with it. But the resin or the rosin is only for the purpose of priming anyway. So it's like it's like a primer on a paint. It only prepares the surface to receive the solder. It doesn't actually contribute really to the whole soldering process. So as far as that's concerned, it won't really make any difference. Yeah, I reckon it's going to be a bastard now. You'll notice that as we've applied extra heat to the wire, now it's quite stiff on the end of the connector, which means that it's tinning the wire underneath the insulation back to a point. There's a couple of things to take from that. Obviously, if you heat it for too long, the ends of the wire will go stiff. The other thing is too, like in scenarios where you need it to be like a waterproof joint, heating the wire for longer will actually allow for obviously penetration of the solder down into the insulation. Now the insulation does melt to the wire, so the very tip of this wire here now will essentially be waterproof. You know, and it'll only be the lead and the brass, which are both non-ferrous metals, that will be exposed to water. In this particular case, lead and brass or copper, they don't corrode like quickly like a ferrous metal would. So it's actually, it's a better joint in that regard. But realistically for RC, you just want it to be, you don't want to have it like, so it's rock hard the whole way down the wire. A little bit on the end there like that, that's fine. If it was too much, you'd probably have to start again. Because you end up stressing the end of the wires, constantly like pulling them on and off the vehicle. And you'll either break the joint or break the wire on the inside of the casing. This is pretty tough wire. You wouldn't normally have issues with that sort of stuff. You'd have to be particularly rough, or it'd be kids or something like that. Wouldn't particularly recommend hanging on to the end of the connectors like this unless you've done heaps of soldering. It does get quite hot. It's not hot to the point that it'll usually burn you. It just tends to startle you, and you'll just drop whatever you're soldering at the time, which is just annoying. You're better off to use something that actually holds it properly. Done it a few times, so obviously that's why I'm sort of hanging on to it. I know how much heat to expect coming through these joins. But that's it. She's done. Connectors are on, heat shrink's on. We'll bloody run through and get the lighter and shrink it right down. Try and insulate everything as best we can on this old battery. Get it right back up to speed. And yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching.